Marvelous Land of Oz Part 2. Before we get to the book, I want to go over one more piece of evidence that I found that Jack Pumpkinhead, right here, might represent Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner. Like I mentioned in the last video, he was an abolitionist and he was famously beaten with a cane on the Senate floor for expressing his abolitionist views and sharing his negative opinions about the Southern congressmen who were slave owners. Now, I couldn't really find any connection between Charles Sumner and pumpkins, but what I did find is that pumpkins were sort of a symbol of abolitionists and kind of Yankees, because pumpkins require a relatively low amount of labor to grow. They might not be the most pleasant thing to eat, but they are edible. And so they sort of became this northern abolitionist symbol because they said, well, we don't need slave labor for our crops if we grow these pumpkins. And I will say, Jack Pumpkinhead has been physically in danger this whole time, including the other 60 pages that I read. His head's coming off left and right. He's losing limbs. He's having to get put back together. So while it's still a stretch, there is some more supporting evidence of his representing Charles Sumner. Anyway, where we left off, the Scarecrow and Jack Pumpkinhead are all buddy-buddy now, and so we need to go back to our friend Tip, who was left behind on the way to the Emerald City. He runs into a girl named General Ginger, who is wearing a dress that has panels of all the different colors of the regions of Oz. So it has a green sash for the Emerald City around the waist, a blue panel for Munchkin Land, a yellow panel for the Land of the Winkies, a red panel for Quadlink Country, and a purple panel for Gilligan Country. And she is leading a revolt of other girls from all areas of Oz to overthrow the Scarecrow and take over the Emerald City. They're each armed with 2 knitting needles, and they say, Oz has been ruled by men long enough, we have had enough, we're gonna take over, and no one is as scared of the Scarecrow as they were of the wizard, so they don't think it'll be that hard. And it's not that hard. They brandish their knitting needles, they walk right in. The gatekeeper of the Emerald City has a gun that is not loaded. He doesn't even know where the ammo is because it's been so long since he had to use it. So they waltz right in, they take over the Emerald City, and the Scarecrow, Jack Pumpkinhead, Tip, and the Sawhorse all have to escape as quickly as they can because they do plan on killing all of them. I imagine that these girls are representing the suffragettes, including L. Frank Baum's mother-in-law. I have to assume that this is her influence coming through. I mean, this is kind of a sleigh. There's not much space for all of them on the Sawhorse, so they tie themselves together and to the Sawhorse so they can run away, and Jack Pumpkinhead goes flying off. They end up in the water, the Scarecrow gets all mushy, so Tip has to lay all of the straw out in the sun so it can dry and then restuff the Scarecrow. Right here, though, we get a couple of inconsistencies with the first book, because at the end of the first book, the Scarecrow gets his brains, and those are pins and needles stuffed in his head. And clearly, that is not a thing here. His head is just full of straw. And they also happen to mention that the flying monkeys are the slaves of Glinda because she has the golden cap. But at the end of the first book, Glinda gave the golden cap back to the flying monkeys, and she had used all 3 of her, charges of commands for them. It's a little bit ironic because Gregory Maguire has some inconsistencies between books in the Wicked series as well. They keep going west and find the Tin Man, who is elated to see his old friend the Scarecrow. He has taken to vanity a little bit, so he's nickel-plated, he is gleaming, and he's also decorated his palace with pictures of his old escapade. He decides to join them and says, well, just our little crew is going to be able to retake the Emerald City just fine because they're not expecting any resistance, and I have an axe. But by this time, Mombi from the beginning of the book, who is very angry that Tip ditched her, has joined General Ginger's cause in the Emerald City and has promised to use her magic to try and stop this whole crew from getting back there to retake it. She mostly does this with illusions. So first she puts in all of these giant sunflowers in a field. They turn to look at everyone in the crew. They can't get around them, and they are spinning and have girls' faces on them to sort of match the girls in the Army of the Revolt. Oddly enough, I remember these from a Wizard of Oz CD-ROM game that I played when I was little, but they eventually realize this is an illusion and keep moving on. And then they meet Mr. H.M. Wogglebug T.E. H.M. Wogglebug T.E. stands for Highly Magnified Wogglebug, Thoroughly Educated. He was a normal-sized bug, and he found his way into a classroom found a nice little place to make his home by a hearth that was pretty warm, and he became thoroughly educated by listening to Professor Know-It-All lecture. But one day the professor caught him and was like, "Oh, look everyone, it's a woggle bug," and he magnified his image on the wall, so he escaped while he was highly magnified and retained his size. So he's like the size of the Tin Woodman. He's huge. Now again, maybe far-fetched, but what I think Wogglebug could represent is the fact that Republican candidates were elected many times in the late 1800s without getting the popular vote. So they were elected through the Electoral College, which would make their victory highly magnified, and they were victorious over William Jennings Bryan, the populist candidate. H.M. Wogglebug T.E. is very elitist. He thinks very highly of himself and his intelligence. He makes a lot of puns that he says are a sign of his intelligence but are insulting to the other people in the group. And like I said, he's huge and wears a high silk hat. So that makes me think he might represent Republican candidates in general, but also possibly Abraham Lincoln. But they ultimately decide to let him join the crew, and they keep going to the Emerald City. They end up enlisting the help of their old friends, the field mice from The Wizard of Oz. The Queen of the Field Mice gives them 12 of her most intelligent mice to hide inside the Scarecrow's coat to be released and surprise the girls in the Army of Revolt at the most opportune time. And then the Queen of the Field Mice also tags along to help them see through all of the illusions that Mombi is throwing in their way to prevent them from getting to the Emerald City. So for example, there's a fire that they walk through and are uninjured because it's not real. There's a big granite wall that they walk right through because it's not real. To me, I wonder if this represents kind of legalese and jargon that is put in to prevent the average person from participating in politics, to prevent people from feeling like they can make a change on their own. And while I don't think this was L. Frank Baum's intention, it also reminded me a little bit of literacy tests that were used to prevent Black people from voting, even after the 14th Amendment was passed. They reach the Emerald City, and at first are met with very little resistance. The Tin Woodman brandishes his axe, and the girls run away. But as they make their way through, they think, wait a minute, this is a little bit too easy. Now they see all of the men doing the housework and the women gossiping, having fun, just really enjoying their newfound rule. The Scarecrow's like, "What's going on?" And a man says, "Why, we've had a revolution, Your Majesty, as you might know very well. And since you went away, the women have been running things to suit themselves. I'm glad you've decided to come back and restore order, for doing housework and minding the children is wearing out the strength of every man in the Emerald City." Said the Scarecrow thoughtfully. "If it is such hard work as you say, how did the women manage it so easily?" "I really do not know," replied the man with a deep sigh. "Perhaps the women are made of cast iron." This again feels like it has influences from the suffragist movement. They go into the palace and attempt to remove General Ginger from her throne, but the other girls in the Army of the Revolt sneak up behind them, remove the Tin Woodman's axe, and they are trapped. But at the last moment, the Tin Woodman is able to open his jacket, release the dozen mice that are in there, scare the girls away, and then they are able to retake the Emerald City that way and bar them from returning. This again sort of reminds me of Republican presidential candidates sort of winning the presidency on a technicality because they didn't win the majority vote. I will say though, I don't know how I feel about this view of the girls and the suffragettes, because it does sort of make it seem like, oh, they're putting up a big fight and acting all tough, but as soon as they're presented with mice, they get so scared and run away. But anyway, that's it for today. See you tomorrow for part 3.